Welcome back to Family Ties and Lies, the channel where blood is thicker than water, but secrets are the thickest of all. Every family has a perfect smile for the cameras, but what happens when the doors finally close? We know that behind every flawless holiday dinner lies a hidden web of deception waiting to unravel. Here, we dig into the most shocking family dramas, bitter betrayals, and dark mysteries that people try to bury forever. Whether it is a brutal feud or a hidden past, we uncover the absolute truth. Grab your snack, get comfortable, and hit that subscribe button right now. The ultimate family secrets are about to be exposed. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, and I went to answer it. Behind me, the wedding china sat on the Sunday dinner table, and tucked beneath 3 of those plates were pages from the 200-page federal case I had spent 6 months quietly building. The FBI was 2 miles down the road, waiting. My name is Patricia Winslow. I am 61 years old, a widow, and the family ringing that doorbell had spent months believing that my grief had made me easy to steal from. They did not understand grief. It does not empty you. Sometimes it strips away everything that was never essential and leaves behind exactly what you need. But to understand how I came to be standing in that hallway on that particular Sunday evening, we have to go back to where all of it started, back to a quiet kitchen, back to a Sunday morning 8 months before this one. Back to the moment I reached into the cabinet above the stove and made a mistake I had been making every single morning for 34 years. I set out 2 coffee cups. I have made coffee the same way for as long as I can remember. 2 scoops of dark roast, a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness, and exactly 6 cups of water in the same ceramic pitcher Gerald bought me at a little shop in Asheville on our honeymoon. The pitcher has a chip on the handle now, from the morning I dropped it the week he was first diagnosed. I never replaced it. Some things you keep not because they are perfect, but because throwing them away feels like agreeing to forget. That first Sunday morning after we buried him, my hands moved through the routine before my mind had any say in the matter. I measured the coffee, I poured the water, and then, without thinking, I set 2 mugs on the counter, side by side, the way I had done every single morning since the spring of 1989. I stood there for a long moment, looking at those 2 mugs. Gerald always took his black, no sugar, no cream, with the newspaper folded open to the opinion section, and the green wooden chair pulled close to the back porch railing, facing the magnolia tree he planted the year our daughter Emily was born. He used to say a man needed 3 things to start his day right: good coffee, honest opinions, and a tree that knew how to bloom without being asked. I put one of the mugs back in the cabinet. Most people call me Pat. I have lived in this red brick house on Magnolia Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina, for 34 years. I raised 2 children in these rooms and spent 29 of those years driving downtown to the glass tower on Tryon Street, working my way from junior analyst to chief financial officer of First Piedmont Bank, a title that came with a corner office, a good salary, and the quiet daily exhaustion of being the only woman sitting at almost every table that mattered. Then Gerald got sick. I did not hesitate. I submitted my retirement papers on a Tuesday, cleaned out my office by Friday, and was sitting beside his hospital bed by the following Monday morning. My colleagues sent flowers. My boss called it brave. I did not know how to explain that bravery had nothing to do with it. Gerald was my person. The paperwork was just paperwork. For 4 years, this house became something different. It became a place of schedules and medications, of slow walks around the block on the good days, and long, sleepless nights beside his bedside when the pain was too much for either of us to rest. It became the place where I understood that love, in its truest form, is not romantic in the way people like to describe it. It is practical. It is showing up. It is knowing exactly how to time his medication so he could still be himself, still be Gerald for a few good hours each afternoon. He passed on the 14th of April. The magnolia tree was in full bloom. The grief counselor I saw twice after the funeral spoke about grief as though it had a fixed length, a tunnel you walked through and eventually exited. But I had already begun to understand that grief is not a tunnel. It is weather. It comes without warning or schedule. You can have a whole week of clear skies and then find yourself standing in your kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, looking at 2 mugs on the counter, and you simply cannot remember how to breathe. I was still standing there when the doorbell rang. Victor and Sandra Winslow were on the front porch. Victor had his hands tucked into the pockets of his khaki slacks, rocking back slightly on his heels the way he always did when he wanted to appear casual about something he had already decided. Sandra was holding a large red ceramic pot with both hands, wearing the wide, careful smile she reserved for church fundraisers and condolence visits. "We were in the neighborhood," Victor said. Sandra made her chicken soup. I stepped aside and let them in. Victor is Gerald's younger brother by 8 years. He is shorter, rounder in the face, with a voice that fills a room before the rest of him has finished entering it. Sandra is his wife of 26 years, always impeccably dressed even on a Sunday afternoon. Her highlighted hair and fitted cashmere cardigan, worn like a kind of carefully maintained armor. Their son Kyle arrived 20 minutes after they did, glancing at his phone before he had fully stepped through the doorway. We sat at the kitchen table, the 4 of us, eating soup from my everyday bowls. Victor talked about Winslow Construction, the commercial development project down in Ballantyne that was running behind schedule, the contracts, the delays. He talked the way men talk when they are accustomed to being the one driving the conversation. And then, somewhere in the middle of a sentence about quarterly projections, he used a phrase, a very specific phrase, a piece of internal accounting language that existed only within the company's financial reporting system and nowhere else. I did not react. I picked up my spoon and took another slow sip of soup. Before they left, Victor suggested continuing the Sunday dinners. A Winslow family tradition, he called it, a way of keeping something of Gerald alive in the house. He said it warmly, in the tone of a man who had already decided how the answer was going to go. I said yes, because I was lonely, and because the house was going to be very quiet once they walked out the door, and because I still believed on that particular Sunday that these were the people Gerald had loved. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the three of them cross the front lawn toward their car, and just before they reached the driveway, Sandra stopped walking. She turned to Kyle and said something low and quick, something meant only for him. Kyle nodded once, a small, quick nod, and they kept moving. I could not hear what she said, but I noticed. The red Le Creuset pot arrived every Wednesday. Sandra always knocked at precisely 12:30 in the afternoon, holding the pot with both hands and wearing an expression of warm, practiced concern that I had come to recognize the way you recognize a particular kind of weather before it fully arrives. Chicken soup one week, beef and vegetable the next, always enough for 2 or 3 days, always accompanied by a quiet comment about how important it was to eat properly during grief, to keep up one's strength, to not disappear into the sadness. I thanked her every time. I meant it, for a while. It was on the 3rd Wednesday that she first mentioned Emily. I had just set the soup pot on the stove when Sandra turned from the counter and said, very gently, that she had been thinking about me and had reached out to my daughter to let her know how I was doing. I asked what she had told her. Sandra tilted her head the way you do when you are delivering news you have already softened into something more manageable than the truth. She said she had told Emily that I seemed to be struggling a little more than I was letting on, that I appeared forgetful some days, distant, that she was worried about me in the way only family could be worried. I poured myself a glass of water and said that was very thoughtful of her. After Sandra left, I called Emily. The call lasted 9 minutes, and it felt like speaking to someone standing just slightly behind a pane of glass. Emily asked how I was sleeping. She asked whether I had been eating. She did not ask about the things we usually talked about, the way we usually talked about them. When I finally hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, trying to decide whether the distance in her voice was something I had imagined or something I had caused. I decided it was probably my fault. That was the particular cruelty of those early weeks. The grief had a way of turning everything inward, until I could no longer tell the difference between what was happening around me and what was simply the weight of my own sadness distorting the shape of ordinary things. I had spent 30 years in rooms full of numbers that did not lie, and yet I could not trust my own reading of a 9-minute phone call with my daughter. I found the slip of paper on a Thursday afternoon. I had been looking for Gerald's old watch, the one he wore every single day of our marriage, and I opened the small drawer on the right side of his desk, where he kept things he considered important. The watch was there. So was a folded receipt from a restaurant we had gone to the year before, and 3 loose buttons, and a business card for a man named Robert Weston from a law firm I had never heard of. Below the printed name, in Gerald's own handwriting, were 4 words. Call when you are ready. I called the number that same afternoon. The line rang 8 times and went to a voicemail without a name on it. I left mine and waited. No one called back. The second Sunday dinner arrived with something new on the table. Victor set the papers down beside the breadbasket while Sandra was still carrying dishes in from the kitchen. He did it casually, the way you set down something you have been carrying for a while and are simply glad to put down. He said they were just an operational authorization, a temporary arrangement to allow him to make certain business decisions on behalf of the company, while I was taking the time I needed to grieve properly. He said Gerald would have wanted things to keep moving. He said it would take me 5 minutes to read and another 5 seconds to sign, and then we could all sit down and enjoy the meal together. Sandra arrived with the salad bowl and poured me a glass of red wine before I had asked for one. Kyle sat across the table and checked his phone twice in the first 4 minutes. I picked up the papers and began to read. The language was dense, the kind of language designed to sound like routine paperwork while quietly handing away something significant. An operational authorization was one way to describe it. A full transfer of voting rights was another way to describe the same thing, buried in the 3rd paragraph where the sentences grew longer and the margins grew noticeably tighter. I read it twice. Then I set it down. I looked across the table at Victor. He was uncapping a pen and sliding it across the tablecloth toward me. And for a brief moment, I was somewhere else entirely. I was back in the winter of 2009, sitting at a different table in a different season of my life, writing a personal check for $80,000 and sliding it across to the same man without saying a word, because Gerald's brother had needed help, and I had believed, without a single question, that this was simply what people who loved each other did. Victor had cashed that check within 48 hours. He had never mentioned it again. I set the pen back down on the table and told him I needed a few more days to look it over carefully. Something moved briefly across his face, quick and involuntary, before the easy smile slipped back into place. He said, of course, absolutely no rush, no pressure whatsoever. I excused myself to get a cardigan from the bedroom. The hallway between the kitchen and the back rooms runs along the side of the dining room, and sound carries through it in a very particular way that I had known about for 34 years, and that no one else at that table had any reason to know. I heard Sandra's voice, low and perfectly certain, meant only for Victor. She is going to sign. She always does. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked to the bedroom, picked up a cardigan I did not need, and walked calmly back to the table. I smiled at all 3 of them and sat back down. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the center of the bed the way I had been doing since April, taking up only my side, out of a habit so deeply worn into me that even now, 8 months later, my body refused to spread into the space Gerald had left. I stared at the ceiling and I thought about the papers Victor had set beside the breadbasket. I thought about the language in the 3rd paragraph. I thought about the way Sandra had poured my wine before I asked for it. And the way Kyle had checked his phone twice in the first 4 minutes. And the way Victor had slid that pen across the tablecloth with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who already knew how the evening was going to end. I got up at 2 a.m. and went to the kitchen. The laptop had been sitting on the shelf above the microwave since the week Gerald died. I had not opened it once in 8 months. My son Michael had set up the password manager before he flew back to Boston, and I had written the codes on a notepad and tucked it inside the cover the way people of my generation do, because we do not entirely trust the things we cannot see. I made coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened the laptop. 30 years of financial analysis does not leave you the way youth leaves you, gradually and without announcement. It stays in the body. It stays in the particular way your eyes move across a column of numbers. The specific instinct that fires before your conscious mind has fully caught up. The way a doctor can look at a set of results and know something is wrong before she has identified exactly what. I had not looked at a financial document in 4 years. It did not matter. The moment the Winslow Construction quarterly reports loaded onto the screen, something in me that had been very quietly sleeping simply woke up. I started with the most recent quarter. Then I went back 1 year. Then 2. The irregularities were not large at first. They were the kind of small, careful movements that only reveal themselves when you are looking at the full picture, rather than any single frame. A vendor payment slightly above market rate, routed through a holding company I did not recognize. A consulting fee paid to an LLC with no public record or website. A series of intercompany transfers that moved money in a direction that served no operational purpose I could identify. Individually, each one was defensible. Together, they told a different story entirely. I made a second cup of coffee and kept going. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window began to shift from black to the particular gray that comes just before dawn, I had traced the pattern back nearly 4 years. The transfers had started small, the way these things always start, cautiously and at intervals wide enough to avoid triggering any automatic review threshold. Then, around the beginning of the 3rd year, the amounts had grown, not dramatically, just steadily, the way water rises in a room with a slow leak. $1,200,000. That was the number I arrived at when I added the total. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about the man who had sat across from me at Sunday dinner, sliding a pen across a white tablecloth with a warm smile on his face. I thought about the years Gerald had spent building that company, the early mornings, and the difficult contracts, and the employees he had treated as though their families were his own concern. I thought about Gerald lying in the blue recliner in the back room, too tired some evenings to do more than hold my hand, trusting that the business he had handed to his brother was being cared for the way he would have cared for it himself. And then I found something else. It was a single invoice, filed inside a scanned folder labeled administrative and dated from a period nearly 2 years before Gerald received his official diagnosis. The invoice was from a private oncology consultation service. The billed name was not Gerald's. The billed address, however, was a property I recognized immediately. It was the address of a vacation cabin Victor and Sandra owned outside of Asheville, the same one they had used as a business mailing address for tax purposes for the past several years. Victor had consulted a cancer specialist privately 6 months before Gerald's own doctors had delivered the news to us in that small beige office on the 4th floor of the hospital. 6 months before I had driven home alone and sat in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself walk through the front door. He had known. He had known what was coming before I did, before Gerald did, and he had used that knowledge not to prepare himself as a brother, not to find ways to help or to be present, but to begin quietly, systematically, moving money out of the company his brother had built. I closed the laptop and sat very still in the kitchen for a long time. The magnolia tree outside the window was a dark shape against the gray morning sky. I looked at it for a while. Gerald had watered that tree himself every summer until his hands became too unsteady to manage the hose, and then I had watered it for him, and I had thought I was doing it for the tree. But I understood now that I had been doing it for him. I got up from the table. I walked down the hall to our room. I sat on the edge of the bed and placed my hand on Gerald's pillow, the way I did most nights, and I spoke very quietly into the stillness of the room. I see it now. Gerald. I see all of it. Michael called on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the funeral. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing my coffee cup when my phone lit up with his name, and I felt the particular, complicated relief of a mother who has been trying not to notice how long it has been since her son called. I dried my hands and answered on the second ring. His voice was careful in the way that voices become careful when someone has been coached or warned or has decided ahead of time how much of themselves they are going to offer. He asked how I was doing. He asked whether I had been getting out of the house. He asked whether I had considered joining a grief support group, and I could hear in the way he phrased it that someone else had suggested he suggest it. I asked him directly. I said, "Michael, has Sandra been in touch with you?" There was a pause that lasted just long enough to tell me everything before he said a single word. He read me the first message she had sent him. It had arrived 3 weeks after Gerald's funeral, and it described me as someone who was struggling more than she was admitting, who had been forgetting things, who had been asking the same questions twice in the same conversation, who had pushed away several people who had tried to help her. Sandra had written it in the warm, concerned tone of a woman who loved her family deeply and simply wanted everyone to be aware of the situation so that I would not be left alone in my difficulty. I asked Michael how many messages there had been in total. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said 17. 17 messages over 8 months. One roughly every 2.5 weeks, each one carefully timed, each one adding a new detail to the portrait Sandra had been assembling of a woman who was slowly losing her grip on herself, on her memory, on her ability to function without assistance. I had spent 8 months wondering why my children's voices had grown careful and distant, blaming my own grief for the space that had opened between us. And the entire time, Sandra had been on the other side of that space, building it brick by careful brick. I told Michael to stay on the line. I called Emily on the other phone. Emily had received 17 messages. Hers had begun slightly later than Michael's, but had followed the same careful progression, starting with gentle concern and graduating over time into something closer to alarm. The most recent one, sent just 11 days ago, had suggested that Emily might want to consider speaking with a professional about options for her mother's long-term care. Long-term care. I was 61 years old with a completely intact mind and 30 years of professional credentials, and Sandra Winslow had been quietly lobbying my own children to begin thinking about who was going to manage me. I told both of them the same thing. Do not respond to her. Do not tell her we have spoken. Not yet. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The anger I felt was not the hot, immediate kind. It was cold and it was clear, and it settled into me the way cold settles into a house in winter, finding every room, missing nothing. I had been so busy blaming my own sadness for the distance in my children's voices that I had not once considered the possibility that someone had been standing between us, carefully widening the gap. I went back to Gerald's desk that afternoon. I opened the drawer where I had found Robert Weston's card, and I sat down in Gerald's chair, and I looked at those 4 words in his handwriting for a long time. Call when you are ready. I thought about what it meant that Gerald had left those words for me. I thought about what it meant that he had left them in the drawer with his watch, among the small things he considered worth keeping. He had not left them somewhere obvious. He had left them somewhere I would only find them when I was looking for something else, when I was ready to be looking. I was not sure I was ready, but I was sure that I was no longer willing to wait. I called the number again. This time it rang only twice before a man's voice answered, calm and unhurried, as though he had been expecting the call at this exact hour on this exact day. Robert Weston, he said. I told him my name. I told him I had found his card in Gerald's desk. There was a brief silence, and then he said something that I have thought about every day since. He said, Mrs. Winslow, your husband came to see me 8 months ago. He asked me to hold something for you until you called. He told me you would know when the time was right. He said you were the smartest person he had ever known, and that when you were ready, you would not need him to explain very much. I pressed my hand flat against the surface of Gerald's desk. I asked Weston what Gerald had left. He said there was a letter. He said there was also a separate matter he needed to explain in person, something Gerald had arranged quietly in the final weeks before he became too ill to manage it himself. He said it was important and that he would prefer to discuss it when we were face to face. I told him I needed a few days first. There was something I had to take care of before I was ready to hear what Gerald had left behind, He said he understood. He said the letter had waited 8 months and it would wait a little longer. I set the phone down on Gerald's desk and looked at the drawer still sitting open in front of me. Then I opened the laptop again. I had known David Mercer for 22 years. We had worked together on 3 fraud investigations during my years at First Piedmont Bank. The kind of cases where the FBI needed someone inside a financial institution who understood how money moved through a system and where it preferred to hide. Mercer was thorough, patient, and deeply unimpressed by the kind of confidence that wealth tends to manufacture in people. Those were qualities I had always respected, and they were the exact qualities I needed now. I called him on a Wednesday evening. I did not explain anything over the phone. I said only that I had something he needed to see, and that I would prefer to meet somewhere other than a federal building. He said he knew a coffee shop in Mint Hill that was quiet on weekday mornings. I said that would be fine. I brought the briefcase Gerald had given me for our 20th anniversary. Brown leather, 2 brass clasps, a small scratch near the bottom left corner from the time I dropped it in a parking garage in 2011. I had not used it since the day I left the bank. It fit against my side, the same way it always had, like something that had simply been waiting for the right occasion. Mercer was already at a corner table when I arrived, his back to the wall the way he always preferred, a plain black coffee in front of him and nothing else. He stood when he saw me. He did not say he was sorry about Gerald. He had sent a handwritten card in April, and men like Mercer understand that the time for condolences eventually passes, and something more practical takes its place. I set the briefcase on the table, opened the clasps, and spent the next 40 minutes walking him through everything I had found: the irregular vendor payments, the shell company transfers, the pattern of withdrawals that had started small and grown steadily across 4 years. The invoice from the private oncology service dated 6 months before Gerald's official diagnosis. The total, confirmed across 3 separate reconciliations, of $1,200,000. Mercer did not interrupt. He looked at each document in the order I presented it, and I watched his expression move through the controlled, careful adjustments I had seen a dozen times before in the years we had worked together. When I finished, he sat back and was quiet for a moment. Then he said it. "You found in 2 weeks what a professional team needs 6 months for." I told him I had a head start. I told him that the particular advantage of being underestimated is that people tend to speak freely in front of you, and that I had been sitting across from these people at dinner tables for months with nothing better to do than listen. We agreed on the terms over the remainder of that first cup of coffee. I would continue attending the Sunday dinners. I would document every conversation, every request, every document placed in front of me. Mercer would handle the investigation on his end, and we would not move until the case was solid enough that no defense attorney could reduce it to a misunderstanding or a family disagreement. I drove home from Mint Hill with the empty briefcase on the passenger seat, and something I had not felt in a very long time settled quietly in my chest. Not happiness, not relief. Something closer to the focused clarity that arrives when you finally know exactly what you are doing and exactly why you are doing it. The fifth Sunday dinner looked identical to all the others from the outside. Sandra had brought a casserole. Kyle arrived 8 minutes late and immediately began scrolling through his phone. Victor opened a bottle of red wine, poured generously, and talked about a zoning approval they were waiting on for a project near Lake Norman. I passed the bread. I asked appropriate questions. I laughed once at something Victor said, and it was not entirely forced. But I was not the same woman who had sat at this table a month ago. When Victor reached into the folder beside his chair and produced the authorization papers for the third time, I accepted them without visible reaction. I set them beside my plate and picked up my fork. He watched me do it, and I could see him quietly recalibrating, trying to determine what it meant that I was neither refusing nor agreeing. I looked at him across the casserole dish and thought about the winter of 2009. He had come to me without Gerald, sitting in my living room on a Tuesday afternoon and explaining that a real estate investment had gone wrong, that he owed money he did not have, and that if Gerald found out, it would damage something between the two brothers that he did not want to damage. He had not asked me directly. He had simply laid the facts out in front of me, the way a man does when he is hoping someone else will solve the problem for him. I had written the check for $80,000 that same evening. I had not told Gerald. I had not asked Victor for a repayment schedule or a written agreement, or even a word of acknowledgement beyond the brief thanks he offered at the front door. I had handed it to him because he was Gerald's brother, and Gerald loved him, and I believed, fully and without reservation, that this was simply what family did for one another. Victor had cashed it within 48 hours. He had never mentioned it again. I was still sitting with that memory when Sandra set a separate sheet of paper on the table beside my plate, distinct from Victor's documents, accompanied by a small and very deliberate smile. I picked it up and read it carefully. It was a mortgage authorization form. The property listed at the top was the address on Magnolia Drive, where I had lived for 34 years. My name was already printed in the signature line. I set it down. I kept my face completely still, and I reached for my wine glass the way a woman reaches for something entirely ordinary. I stayed at the table for another 40 minutes after Sandra set that paper beside my plate. I ate the casserole. I accepted a second glass of wine I did not want. I listened to Victor discuss a zoning permit and Kyle describe a golf weekend with people I had never heard of. When the evening finally ended and I had said my goodbyes at the front door, I walked to my car, pulled out of the driveway at the same unhurried pace I had arrived, and drove exactly 4 blocks before I pulled over and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. The house on Magnolia Drive was not simply a financial asset. I knew that before I had finished reading the first line of that authorization form. It was the room where Emily had learned to walk, gripping the doorframe between the kitchen and the hallway, and taking 3 unsteady steps before sitting down hard on the floor and looking up at me with an expression of pure surprise. It was the window Gerald had repainted every 5 years because he was particular about the shade. A color he called honest as opposed to the slightly yellower white the previous owners had used. It was the back porch and the green wooden chair and 34 years of Sunday mornings with 2 cups of coffee and the magnolia tree and the man who had planted it. They had forged my signature to take all of it. I called Mercer from the car. It was 9:47 in the evening, and he answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. I described the mortgage authorization form from memory, and when I finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to tell me that what I had described was serious. He said he needed to make some calls. He told me to go home and wait. I went home. I sat in the kitchen with the lights turned low and looked at the photographs on the wall beside the pantry door. Gerald and me at Emily's graduation, both of us squinting into the May sun. Michael at age 7 in the yard, holding a garden hose with the concentrated expression he still wore as an adult whenever he was trying to do something exactly right. Gerald and me on the back porch the summer before his diagnosis. The magnolia tree in full bloom behind us. I did not cry. I had done my crying in the early months, in the dark, in the particular loneliness of a bed that had become too wide. What I felt sitting in that kitchen was different and considerably colder. It was the specific sensation of understanding exactly how much you stand to lose. Mercer called back at 11:32. He told me that forging a spouse's signature on a mortgage authorization was a federal crime, that the document I had described constituted wire fraud, given the interstate financial instruments involved, and that it gave his office standing to treat the property itself as evidence in an active federal investigation. He let me absorb that for a moment, and then he said it plainly. "We can freeze that mortgage as criminal evidence," he said. "But Pat, we have 48 hours. What that meant in practical terms was that he needed to get the paperwork in front of a federal judge before the bank could act on the existing authorization. If he could do it within that window, the property would be locked as evidence for the full duration of the case, and the bank could not move against it. I told him to do it. What followed were the 2 longest days I had known since the week Gerald died. I kept to my routines with the steadiness of someone who has decided that falling apart is simply not an available option. I watered the magnolia tree. I returned a call from Emily I had been putting off. I made a grocery list, went to the store, and bought things I did not particularly need because I could not stand to be inside the house with nothing to do but wait. On the afternoon of the second day, Mercer called with 2 pieces of news. The first was that the freeze order had been signed. The mortgage was locked. The bank could not move against the property for as long as the investigation remained active, which Mercer estimated at a minimum of several months. The second piece of news was harder to sit with. His team had been examining the metadata from the deleted email files I had identified on Gerald's computer. What they found confirmed what I had suspected, but had not fully allowed myself to believe. There had been a series of emails between Gerald and Robert Weston in the final weeks before Gerald became too ill to manage his own affairs. Gerald had been trying to update his estate documents to transfer additional assets and ensure certain protections were in place, specifically for me. Those emails had been deleted from Gerald's account by someone using a device registered to Kyle Winslow. The dates matched a period when Kyle had been given access to Gerald's computer on the stated grounds of helping him manage his correspondence. Gerald had tried to take care of me even at the very end, and Kyle had made certain those last efforts never reached anyone who could act on them. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. The magnolia tree outside the kitchen window was catching the last of the afternoon light. The way it did in early autumn when the angle of the sun changed and the leaves turned a particular shade of gold that Gerald had always stopped to point out every single year, as though it might be easy to miss. I was still sitting there when my phone lit up with a number I recognized. I let it ring twice before I answered. Victor's voice was flat and precise, entirely stripped of the warm, unhurried tone he had used for months. "Pat," he said, "I need your answer this Sunday. There is no more time." The dress was navy blue with small white buttons down the front, and Gerald had told me 3 separate times that it was his favorite thing I owned. The first time was the evening I brought it home from the store in 2014. The second was our anniversary dinner 2 years after that. The third was in the last good month before the treatments made him too tired for long evenings out. When I had worn it to a concert in the park and he had looked at me across the blanket with the particular expression he reserved for things he found genuinely beautiful. I took it out of the closet on the morning of the 6th Sunday dinner. I was not sentimental about it. I was strategic. The dress was part of the picture I had been carefully maintaining for months. The picture of a quiet, composed widow still working through her grief, still showing up to family dinners with the small, dignified gestures that people in that situation are expected to make, still not quite capable of the decisive action being demanded of her. I put it on, checked the mirror once, and drove to the dinner the same way I had driven to all the others. 2 days earlier, Mercer had called me while I was in the parking lot of the grocery store to tell me that Victor had retained a private investigator 3 weeks prior. The investigator had been making inquiries in certain professional circles, reaching out to former colleagues of mine at the bank, attempting to construct a portrait of a woman who was emotionally compromised, financially naive, or in some way unreliable as a witness or a decision maker. Mercer said his team was monitoring the situation closely. He told me to continue exactly as I had been and give them nothing of value to work with. I found this information clarifying in a way I had not anticipated. The 6th Sunday dinner was nearly identical to the others. Sandra had made pot roast with roasted potatoes, served in the same heavy ceramic dishes she always brought out for these occasions. Victor talked about a commercial development near the airport moving through its final approval stages. The wine was a red I recognized from previous Sundays and had never particularly enjoyed. The difference arrived halfway through the meal. I made an observation about the commercial lending environment in Charlotte, something directly relevant to what Victor had been discussing, something drawn from 30 years of working inside that exact environment. I spoke 2 sentences. Kyle set his fork down, looked at me with the patient expression of someone waiting for a child to finish an incomplete thought, and then proceeded to explain the concept I had just articulated back to me in considerably simpler terms, as though I might be having difficulty following my own reasoning. Sandra watched this happen and said absolutely nothing. She simply reached for her wine glass and turned her attention to the centerpiece. I let Kyle finish. I thanked him for the clarification. Then I turned to Victor and asked a follow-up question about his airport project, a question specific enough to demonstrate, to anyone paying attention, that I understood the relevant mechanics of commercial lending at a level Kyle had not come close to summarizing. Victor answered it. Kyle looked at his phone. I drove home alone with the radio off. Mercer's message arrived while I was still 2 miles from Magnolia Drive. It was brief. He said the final warrant applications were prepared and ready to file, that his team was in position, and that all he needed from me was a date. He needed to know when I wanted it to end. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. I did not go inside. I sat in the car and looked at the yellow light coming through the kitchen window, the same light that had been burning in that window for as long as I could remember. Gerald had started leaving it on in the last 2 years of his life, when he could no longer stay awake past 8 in the evening. He would go to bed early and leave the kitchen light on so that whenever I came in, regardless of the hour, the house would not be completely dark. He had been gone for 8 months, and I still left it on every night. I sat there until the engine cooled and the neighborhood went quiet around me. I thought about the envelope Weston had described on our first call, sitting in a locked drawer in his office, sealed and untouched since the afternoon Gerald had placed it there in the final weeks before his hands became too unsteady to hold a pen reliably. I thought about what it had cost Gerald to arrange all of it quietly, to find a lawyer he trusted, to compose whatever he had needed to say, to do it without alarming me while I was still learning how to carry the weight of what was coming for us both. He had been protecting me even then, from a distance I had not known existed. I picked up my phone and called Robert Weston. He answered on the first ring. I apologized for the late hour, and he said there was no need for that. His voice was the same unhurried, careful voice from our first conversation, the voice of a man who understood that patience was simply a form of respect for the work. I told him I was ready to come in. Weston said he was glad to hear it. He said the envelope had not moved since Gerald left it, and that there was the separate matter as well, the arrangement Gerald had made quietly, which he preferred to walk me through in person before anything else was set in motion. He asked if I could come to his office in the morning. I looked at the yellow light in the kitchen window. I told him I would be there at 9 o'clock. Robert Weston's office was on the 4th floor of a narrow building on East Trade Street, the kind of office that belonged to a lawyer who had been practicing long enough to stop caring whether the furniture made an impression. The shelves held actual books with broken spines. The desk was wide and organized in the manner of someone who knows precisely where everything is. A window facing east let in the morning light directly, without any particular effort to arrange it. Weston was already standing when I came in. He was a trim man in his late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent a long career delivering difficult news and had learned that the most useful thing you can offer a person in those moments is simply your full and undivided attention. He did not make small talk. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, reached into the top left drawer, and set a plain white envelope on the surface between us. It was sealed. Gerald's handwriting was on the front. Just my name. Patty. He had not called me Patricia since the day we met. Weston said he would give me a few minutes and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. I sat across from that envelope for longer than I would have expected, longer than I had anticipated needing. I looked at the 2 syllables of my name in Gerald's handwriting, the slight leftward lean of his letters that had always been there, the way he made the first letter just a little larger than the rest. Not as a stylistic choice, but simply because that was how he had always written. I picked it up and opened it. The letter was 4 pages, written on both sides of 2 sheets of plain white paper, the handwriting more careful and deliberate than Gerald's usual script. He had been concentrating. I could tell from the way the letters were formed that he had written it on a good day, one of the clear-headed mornings that had come less and less frequently toward the end, and that he had taken his time with every word. He began by apologizing. He said he had known for nearly a year before he died that something was wrong with the way Victor was managing the company. He had noticed small things at first, things that could be explained away if you were willing to explain them. And for a while he had been willing. He told himself Victor was under pressure, that the business was going through a difficult stretch, that his brother deserved the benefit of the doubt in the same way he himself had needed it at certain points in his life. Then the numbers became impossible to ignore. He said he had not told me because I was already carrying more than any person should be asked to carry, because he was dying, and he knew it. And the last thing he wanted was to place another weight on what I was managing every single day. With a grace he said he had never stopped being in awe of. He said he was sorry for that. He said that keeping someone in the dark, even with the best of intentions, was still a form of not trusting them, and that I had deserved better. He said he had done the only thing he knew how to do, which was to prepare things as carefully as he could and trust me to be exactly who I had always been. The separate account was described on the 3rd page, an account in my name only, held at a bank in another state, with a balance he had been building quietly for 3 years by setting aside portions of his personal dividends before Victor could absorb them into the company ledgers. The access information was written out in full, including a 4-digit code that was Emily's birthday. The total was enough to matter. on the final page, in the last paragraph, he wrote something I have since committed entirely to memory. He said he had watched me give up more than he ever had the words to properly thank me for, that he had watched me set aside things that mattered deeply to me in order to be present for him, and that there had not been a single day of his illness when he had taken that lightly, or considered it anything other than the most profound gift one person could offer another. He said he hoped I would take whatever came next and build something entirely my own. Something that had nothing to do with his illness and everything to do with who Patricia Winslow had always been before the illness arrived. He said he loved me. He said he had always loved me. He said the magnolia tree was going to be spectacular next spring. I set the letter down on my knee and looked out the east-facing window. The crying came slowly and quietly, the way it does when it has nowhere urgent to be, when it is simply the body's honest and long overdue response to being seen completely by another person. It was not the heavy, gasping grief of those early months that arrived without warning in parking lots and quiet rooms. It was something quieter and more specific. The particular sensation of being known by someone who had taken the time, even at the very end of everything, to say so clearly and in his own handwriting. I sat with it for several minutes. Then I folded the letter carefully along its original creases. I opened the top button of my jacket and placed the folded pages inside the inner pocket, against my chest, where I intended to keep them. Weston came back in when I knocked lightly on the open door. He sat down across from me and waited without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. I looked at him steadily across the desk. "I am ready now," I said. "This ends Sunday." I woke at 5 a.m. on the last Sunday, while the sky outside was still the particular shade of dark that comes just before the first suggestion of dawn. I lay still for a moment, the way I had been doing for 8 months, out of habit or something closer to ritual, because the transition from sleep to waking had become something I moved through carefully now, one deliberate step at a time. Then I got up. The china was on the top shelf of the cabinet in the dining room, wrapped in the cloth I had packed it in the last time we used it, which had been Christmas 3 years ago. 12 place settings, hand-painted with small blue flowers around the rim. We had found the set in a little shop in Asheville on the second day of our honeymoon, and Gerald had carried the box to the car himself because he said that was the right way to handle something that was going to matter for a long time. I lifted the first setting down and unwrapped it. The plate was exactly as I remembered. The blue flowers were the particular shade that sits darker than sky and lighter than navy, the color of early evening in summer. I set it carefully on the dining room table and went back for the next one. It took nearly 40 minutes to bring everything down, unwrap it, and arrange it properly. I did not rush. This was not a meal I was preparing. It was something else entirely, something closer to a ceremony, and ceremonies deserve to be conducted with the appropriate amount of care. I cut magnolia branches from the tree in the backyard while the coffee was brewing. 3 branches from the lower section where the blooms were fullest, the way Gerald had always done when he wanted flowers inside. He had a specific theory about which branches to take and how the tree would grow back more fully if you chose correctly, and I had watched him apply it every spring for 34 years. I cut them the way he had shown me and arranged them in the tall glass vase on the sideboard. I ironed the white linen tablecloth. I do not iron as a general practice, not anymore. But the cloth had been folded in the drawer for several months, and the creases showed, and I wanted everything to look exactly right. I set up the ironing board in the kitchen and worked through it slowly, pressing each section flat before moving to the next, without any particular hurry. By 10 in the morning, the table was set. The china was in place. The magnolia branches stood in the vase, and the linen lay flat and white beneath it all. I stood at the entrance to the dining room and looked at it for a long moment. Gerald would have stopped in that doorway and said, with the quiet sincerity he reserved for things he genuinely meant, that I had a real gift for this. I stood there and let myself believe that was still true. Then I went to the briefcase. The documents were organized exactly as I had compiled them, divided into groups by category and date. 197 pages of financial records, transfer authorizations, metadata reports, and correspondence that together formed a complete and irrefutable account of everything Victor Winslow had done across 4 years. Mercer's team had added 3 final pages in the last week, documents that anchored the case in a way that left no room for interpretation or doubt. 200 pages in total. I set the briefcase beside my chair, in the spot where it had sat at every one of these dinners for the past several months, where no one had ever looked at it closely enough to wonder what it held. Then I took a single sheet from the front of the file. It was the summary page, the one Mercer's team had prepared that listed, in 2 clean columns, the total amounts transferred and the names of every holding company involved. I made 3 copies on the printer in Gerald's study. I folded each one carefully and slid it beneath each of the 3 plates that were not my own, tucking them just inside the rim so that nothing was visible from above. The blue flowers on the china looked exactly as they always had. Nothing showed, nothing suggested from any angle that the table was anything other than what it appeared to be. I touched the front of my jacket briefly, where Gerald's letter was folded in the inner pocket. Still there. I spent the afternoon cooking. The pot roast Gerald had always called the definitive version, with small potatoes and the particular combination of herbs he had spent years asking me to refine. The cornbread he liked. The green beans cooked the way his mother had taught me, low and slow with smoked meat for flavor. I set everything on low heat and let the house fill with the smell of it, the way it had on the best Sundays, the ones when cooking was pleasure rather than obligation. At precisely 5:58 in the evening, I untied the apron and hung it on the hook beside the refrigerator. The doorbell rang at 6 o'clock. Victor came in first, then Sandra, then Kyle, already looking at his phone before he had fully stepped inside. Sandra moved into the dining room, ahead of the others the way she always did, her customary survey of the space. And then she stopped. She looked at the table for a long moment, the china, the magnolia branches, the linen, the careful, considered beauty of all of it laid out together. She turned to me with the warm smile she had been wearing for months. "You set such a beautiful table," she said. "What is the occasion?" I looked at her steadily from across the room. "There is one," I said. "Tonight is our last Sunday dinner." The dinner began the way all the others had. Sandra served the food from the dishes she carried in from the kitchen, with the competent ease of a woman accustomed to managing other people's tables. Victor poured the wine. Kyle accepted a plate and immediately positioned his phone beside it with the habitual precision of someone who has done it so many times it no longer requires thought. We passed the bread basket. We talked about something unremarkable. I ate slowly and watched the room. The first indication that tonight was different arrived about 20 minutes in the slight shift of tone when Victor set down his wine glass, reached into the folder he had brought, and placed the authorization papers on the table. He had done this at other dinners, but not quite like this. There was no warmth in it tonight, no casual suggestion that it was merely a formality, no offer to walk me through the language. He set the documents in front of me and looked at me with the expression of a man who had exhausted his patience for the longer approach. "Sign them tonight," he said. "That is all I am asking." Sandra did not reach for the wine bottle this time. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the tablecloth. Kyle set his phone face down, which he had never done before. I looked at the papers. I looked at the pen Victor had placed beside them. And then I looked at Victor. "Do you remember the winter of 2009? I said. The question did not land in the room as a question. It arrived the way a door closing firmly arrives, as something final rather than something open. Victor's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a brief tightening around the eyes that someone not paying close attention would have missed entirely. He said he did not know what I was referring to. I said he did. I told them all of it. I told it evenly and without particular emphasis, the way you describe a sequence of events that happened a long time ago and have since been folded into a larger understanding of how things actually were. A Tuesday afternoon, the living room. A man who had come to ask for help without quite asking for it, who laid out a problem and then waited to see what would be offered. A check for $80,000 written that same evening. Not mentioned to Gerald. No repayment discussed. No agreement of any kind. Simply handed over because the man sitting across from me was Gerald's brother, and Gerald loved him, and I had believed, with everything I had, that this was what you did for the people your husband loved. Victor had that check cashed within 48 hours. I said. He never mentioned it again. And then I looked at him across the table, across the white linen and the good china, and the magnolia branches and the meal I had spent the afternoon preparing. And I said the only thing left to say. And you still did all of this. The room was very quiet. I stood up. I reached beside my chair and picked up the brown leather briefcase, the one I had carried to every one of these dinners for the past several months, the one Sandra had walked past a dozen times without interest, the one Kyle had never looked at because it was simply the kind of object a woman like me would carry. The sort of thing you stop noticing because you have already decided it holds nothing worth your attention. I set it on the table and opened the clasps. I placed the documents beside the breadbasket, in the space between the candles and the china. 200 pages, organized and tabbed, the way 30 years of professional work looks when assembled by someone who understands precisely what they are doing. Then I began. The transfer started in the spring 4 years ago, I said. Small amounts at first, moved through a holding company registered in Delaware under a name that appeared in no public record. I cited the account numbers. I named the dates. I listed the amounts, starting small and growing steadily over time, the way these things always grow when no one appears to be paying attention. By the end of the second year, the monthly transfers had tripled. By the end of the third year, the cumulative total had crossed $700,000, $1,200,000 over 4 years, I said. Every cent documented and verified. I watched Victor's face while I spoke. The color in it was doing something I had not seen before. Not the florid rage of a man being refused what he wanted. Not the careful blankness of a man managing his response. It was something paler and more particular than either of those things. I reached into the briefcase one final time and removed a single sheet of paper. I said there was one more item. I said it was perhaps the most significant one. I placed the invoice on the table beside the other documents. The date at the top was clearly legible. The name of the private oncology consultation service was clearly legible. The billing address, which Victor had used for tax correspondence for years, was clearly legible. I said that Victor had consulted a cancer specialist privately, 6 months before Gerald's own doctors had told us what was happening. I said he had known what was coming before I did, before Gerald did, and that he had used that knowledge not to prepare himself as a brother, but to begin moving money while no one was watching. A knock came at the front door. 3 sharp, deliberate sounds that carried clearly through the house. I glanced at my watch. Right on time. I walked to the front door and opened it. Mercer was standing on the porch with 3 agents behind him, their dark jackets catching the light from the hallway, their movements the particular kind of precise and unhurried that comes from having done this kind of work for a long time. Behind them, 2 vehicles sat at the end of the driveway with their lights off. I could see the outlines of additional agents positioned along the side of the house. Mercer looked at me the way he had always looked at me during our years working together, with the direct, unadorned attention of someone taking a careful reading. He nodded once. I stepped back and let them in. What happened over the next several minutes was something I have thought about a great deal since that evening. Not because it was dramatic in the way that word is usually meant, but because of how orderly it was. There was no shouting. There were no drawn weapons. The agents moved through the house with the systematic efficiency of people executing a plan that had been assembled carefully over time, which of course it had been, Victor stood up from the dinner table when the first two agents entered the dining room. He stood the way a man stands when he is still trying to calculate whether the situation can be managed, still determining whether there is a version of this that can be redirected or talked through. He was still working through that calculation when one of the agents asked him quietly to place his hands behind his back. He said he wanted to call his attorney. The agent said he was welcome to do that from the federal processing facility. I turned to Sandra before they reached her. Emily and Michael are on their way to Charlotte tonight, I said. They know about all 17 messages. Sandra had been standing beside the sideboard with one hand resting on the edge of it, and I watched something leave her face in the moment after I said those words that I had never seen leave it before. The composure went out of it completely, not gradually the way I might have expected, but all at once, as though the composure had only ever been a surface, and the surface had simply been taken away. What remained beneath it was not grief, and it was not remorse. It was the specific, undisguised terror of a woman who has spent a lifetime depending on a particular kind of control, and has just understood in a single instant that the control is gone. An agent guided her toward the front hallway. She began to cry as they led her out. Not the quiet, personal kind of crying, but the other kind, the kind calibrated to be heard and interpreted by as many people as possible, the kind she had deployed in Gerald's kitchen the morning she brought the first pot of soup. The agents did not slow their pace. I looked at Kyle. He was standing in the space between the dining room and the living room, still holding his phone. Though he had stopped looking at it some time ago, he was watching the activity around him with an expression I recognized, not because I had seen it on his face before, but because I understood what it was. It was the expression of someone who has understood, all at once and far too late, the complete weight of every choice they have made over a long period of time. You deleted the last emails Gerald ever sent, I said. His final wishes for me. Kyle did not answer. He looked at me, and then he looked at the table, at the china we had eaten from, at the magnolia branches still standing in the glass vase on the sideboard, at the 200 pages of documents spread across the white linen. He looked at all of it, the way you look at something you have helped destroy when the destruction has become fully visible and real and impossible to look away from. Victor was in handcuffs by the front door. He had stopped talking, which surprised me somewhat. I had expected him to maintain the performance longer, to insist on attorneys and procedural irregularities, the various protections that men of his particular confidence tend to reach for when cornered. Instead, he was simply standing there, his shoulders slightly forward, looking at the floor in a way that was neither dignified nor its opposite, but simply finished. Sandra's voice faded as she was walked to one of the vehicles outside. The house went quieter than I had anticipated. I stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table I had set that morning. The china was still in place, each plate sitting precisely where I had arranged it. The magnolia branches were still fresh in the vase. The candles had burned down perhaps an inch. The bread basket still held 2 rolls that no one had touched. It looked, from where I stood, very much like a Sunday dinner that had simply been interrupted in the middle of the meal. Mercer came and stood beside me briefly. He said the processing would take several hours and asked whether I needed anything before he went back outside to manage the scene. I told him I was fine. He nodded and left. I stood there a moment longer, looking at the room I had prepared with such specific and deliberate intention, and then became aware that I was not alone. I turned around. Kyle was standing in the center of the living room. He was not in handcuffs. He had not been approached by any of the agents, who had their instructions and understood precisely who they were there for. He was simply standing in the room, still holding his phone at his side, looking at me with eyes that held nothing remaining in them but the particular kind of wreckage that cannot be performed or redirected or shaped into anything salvageable. He did not speak. Neither did I. The sound of the vehicles outside diminished gradually, the way rainfall diminishes, the engine noise growing less distinct until it had reduced to something felt more than heard. And then there was only the house and the two of us standing in it. Kyle had not moved from the center of the living room. He was still holding his phone at his side, though I was fairly certain he had forgotten it was there. His face had gone through several changes over the course of the evening, from the studied indifference he had worn at the beginning of the dinner to the specific, unguarded openness that comes when a person has simply run out of the resources required to maintain any performance at all. He looked younger than 30 and considerably more frightened than I had ever seen him. I sat down in the armchair near the window. After a moment, he sat on the sofa. Neither of us said anything for a while. When he finally spoke, his voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. The ease had gone out of it entirely. The casual authority that comes from spending one's life in rooms where the expenses are covered by someone else's labor. What remained was quieter and considerably less certain of itself. He said his father had brought him into the company when he was 24 years old, not as an offer, but as an announcement. He said he had been told what his responsibilities were, what accounts he would manage, and what was expected of his discretion. He said there had been a period in the first year when he had asked questions and been informed that asking questions was not his function. His function was to sign what needed to be signed, to manage what he was told to manage, and to understand that everything he had, his position, his income, his standing in the family, depended entirely on his continued willingness to do exactly that. He said his mother had called him the night before the first document was falsified and told him that if he was not going to be useful to the family, he would find out precisely how little the family needed him. He said he had believed her. I listened to all of it without speaking. I had spent a long time in rooms where people explained the choices they had made and the circumstances that had shaped those choices. And I had learned over those years that the most useful thing you can offer someone in that particular moment is simply the space to say the thing they have been carrying, without the additional weight of someone responding before the saying is finished. When he stopped, he looked at the floor. Then he looked at me. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I know what I did. I know what I chose not to do, and I understand the difference between those two things. I just needed someone to understand how it happened, because I have been asking myself how it happened for a very long time. I looked at him across the living room for a moment. Then I stood and walked to the small table beside the front door, the one where I kept car keys and accumulated mail, the one with the single narrow drawer. I opened the drawer. I prepared this for you in the 3rd month. Kyle, I said. I removed a plain white envelope and held it toward him. He looked at it the way people look at things they are not entirely certain they have the right to want. Then he came across the room and took it from my hand and opened it slowly. The document inside was 4 pages. The letterhead was from the Office of the United States Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina. His name appeared in the first paragraph. The language was precise and carefully constructed, the kind of language written by people who understand the consequences of imprecision. It was a formal immunity agreement, signed by the federal prosecutor, contingent on 2 specific conditions. The first was his full and cooperative testimony in the criminal proceedings against his parents, including any supplementary interviews the prosecution required in the months preceding trial. The second was his participation, for a minimum of 2 years, in a program called the Sunday Table Foundation, the details of which were described in an attached document. The program was designed to support individuals drawn into family-based financial crimes who were working to rebuild their lives with integrity. His background and experience, the document noted, made him a potentially meaningful resource for others in similar circumstances. Kyle read through it twice. I watched his hands while he read. They were not entirely steady. When he finished, he looked up. "Why would you do this for me?" he said. I thought about Gerald for a moment. I thought about the particular patience Gerald had always extended toward people he believed were capable of more than they were currently demonstrating, the way he had extended it toward his own brother for far longer than the evidence had ever supported. "Because Gerald would have wanted it," I said. "And because your choices do not have to define the rest of your life." Kyle stood in the living room holding a document that offered the possibility of a different future, and I watched something shift in the way he was holding himself. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was the weight in his shoulders, the particular forward lean of someone who has been bracing against something for a very long time, moving slightly, settling differently. He straightened, not all the way, but enough. He nodded once, looked down at the pages in his hands, and then nodded again, quietly, the way a person nods when they are confirming something to themselves. The days that followed were the quietest I had experienced in a long time. Not the quiet of grief, which is not really quiet at all, but a kind of constant low noise with no identifiable source. Not the quiet of the months I had spent moving through routines alone, which is the quiet of something missing rather than the quiet of something settled. This was different. This was the house simply being a house, and the days simply being days, and the particular absence of something unfinished pressing against the edges of everything. Mercer called on a Thursday morning, several weeks after the arrests, while I was standing in the backyard with my coffee, looking at the magnolia tree. He said his team had obtained the full report from the private investigator Victor had retained. 2 months of inquiry, he told me. Extensive outreach to former colleagues, past business contacts, and people I had worked alongside across my 3 decades at the bank. He said the results were entirely clean. I asked him what the investigator had written in his summary. Mercer read it to me. The investigator had written, in the final paragraph of a 12-page document, that in his professional experience conducting background research for litigation purposes, it was unusual to encounter a subject with no pattern of professional grievances, no former associates who expressed negative sentiment, and no record of disputes of any kind. He had written that his conclusion, after 2 months of thorough inquiry, was straightforward. This woman has no enemies because she has never wronged anyone. I stood in the backyard with my coffee going cold in my hand and listened to Mercer read those words back to me. He asked what I thought. I said the investigator was wrong about one thing. I said I had enemies. I just had not created them. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was about right. Emily arrived on a Friday evening. She came directly from the airport without stopping anywhere, still wearing the scarf she had put on in Denver that morning, carrying 2 bags and a covered dish she had somehow prepared on the same day she had booked a last-minute flight to Charlotte. She walked in through the front door, looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of a daughter who has been worried about her mother for a long time, and then she simply put her arms around me and stood there. I let her. Neither of us said anything for a while, because there was too much to say, and no urgency about starting any particular part of it. Michael arrived the following afternoon with groceries, which was exactly the thing he would do. We had dinner that night in the kitchen, not in the dining room. We ate pasta from the everyday bowls and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. The way families talk when they have been apart too long and need to remember how it feels to simply be in the same room together. Michael told a story about something that had happened on a commuter train in Boston, something Emily had apparently heard before and I had not. And I sat at that table and laughed at the right moments and felt something I had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular sensation of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Later, after Michael had gone to bed, Emily and I stayed at the kitchen table with decaf coffee and the comfortable quiet of 2 people who know each other well enough to not require continuous conversation. She asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. So I did. All of it, in order. Starting with the morning, I had set 2 cups on the counter, and ending with Kyle standing in the living room with a document in his hands and his shoulders finally straight. She listened without interrupting, which is something she had learned from me and which I was grateful for that evening. The trial began 6 weeks later. The federal courthouse in downtown Charlotte was a building I had walked past hundreds of times during my years at the bank. A solid and deliberately unremarkable structure that communicated through its proportions and its materials that what happened inside was serious and would be treated accordingly. I sat in the front row of the gallery on the first day with Emily on my left and Michael on my right. Victor came in first, in the standard issue clothing of the federal holding facility, and the difference between the man who had poured wine at my dining room table and the man who shuffled through the side entrance of that courtroom was not simply a matter of clothing. It was something that had left the way he carried himself, some fundamental assumption about his own untouchability that had been quietly and permanently removed. Sandra followed, looking considerably older than she had at any of the Sunday dinners. The way people look when they have been separated from the resources that allow them to maintain a particular image of themselves. The attorneys arranged their materials. The judge entered. The room settled into the specific silence of a place where consequential things are about to happen. And then the prosecutor called the first witness for the government. Kyle walked through the door from the holding area and crossed to the witness stand. He wore a plain dark suit, nothing extravagant, the kind of thing a person wears when they want to be seen for who they are rather than what they possess. He moved through the room without looking at the gallery. He sat down and adjusted the microphone. From across the room, Victor looked at his son with an expression I recognized immediately, having been the recipient of a version of it for years. It was the expression of a man who has spent his life issuing instructions through a glance and expected them to be followed. Kyle looked at the prosecutor and waited for the first question. He did not look back at his father. Kyle's testimony took most of the morning. He answered each question from the prosecutor in the same measured, deliberate way, without embellishment and without deflection, the way a person speaks when they have decided that the only useful thing remaining is precision. I watched his face from the front row of the gallery as he described the structure of the fraud, the specific mechanics of how money had moved from investor accounts through a series of holding companies and into private trust arrangements, all of it orchestrated by his father with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it long enough to have complete confidence in his own system. He described the first document he had been asked to sign. He said he had been 24 years old and new to the company when the first document was placed in front of him by his father without explanation, with the implicit understanding that the signature was expected and that hesitation was not. He said he had asked once what the document authorized. His father had told him that asking questions was not his function, and that if he was uncomfortable with his function, he was welcome to return to the life he had been living before the family had decided to include him in something of value. He described the emails. He said Gerald had sent messages to his attorney in the final weeks before his cognition became unreliable, messages outlining his estate intentions and his specific wishes for his wife. He said his mother had called him the evening before he deleted them and explained what needed to happen and why, in the tone she had always used for things she considered obvious. He said the deletion had taken him approximately 4 minutes. He said he had thought about it every day in the time since. There was a moment in the middle of his testimony when the courtroom went very still, the way a room goes still when the specific weight of something true has settled into it, and everyone present can feel the difference between that and everything preceding it. I sat between my children and looked at my hands and did not look at Victor. When Kyle finished, the defense was given the opportunity to cross-examine. The attorney for Victor made several attempts to establish that Kyle had operated independently, that the financial decisions had reflected his own professional judgment rather than direct instructions. Kyle answered each question in the same careful, direct manner he had maintained throughout, and the attempt did not go well for the defense. Sandra's attorney called her to the stand in the afternoon. She had prepared carefully for this moment. I could see it in the way she walked to the stand and arranged herself in the chair, in the particular angle of her head and the specific calibrated texture of her distress, which was audible without being quite loud enough to require management by the court officer. She described herself as a wife and mother who had loved her family and trusted her husband's judgment, and had not been aware of the full scope of what was happening with the financial operations of the company. When her attorney finished, the prosecutor stood. He asked a single preliminary question before proceeding. He asked Sandra whether she was familiar with a background investigation conducted by a licensed private investigator into the personal and professional history of Patricia Winslow. Sandra said she was not certain what he was referring to. The prosecutor read the relevant sentence from the investigator's final report, the one about no enemies and no record of having wronged anyone, and then asked Sandra to reconcile that finding with the 17 text messages she had sent to Patricia Winslow's adult children over 8 months, describing their mother as cognitively impaired and emotionally unreliable. Sandra looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at the table in front of him. She did not answer the question. Victor chose to take the stand on the final day of testimony, which his attorney had advised against and which Victor had apparently decided was necessary anyway, because he was a man who had always trusted his own capacity to manage a room. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. He characterized the financial arrangements as standard industry practice, misrepresented by a grieving widow with a personal agenda. He described Pat as someone who had never understood the complexity of real estate finance and had allowed her grief to distort her interpretation of entirely legitimate transactions. At one point, with the specific dismissiveness of a man who considers a single phrase to be a sufficient answer, he said that she had simply never understood business. I sat in the front row and did not move and did not change my expression. The prosecutor's closing argument took 45 minutes. It was precise, well organized, and methodical in the way that the strongest financial fraud cases are, because the facts themselves, assembled in the correct order and described in plain language, do not require persuasion. They need only to be clearly seen. The judge spent 2 days reviewing the submitted evidence before reconvening the court. When he took his seat on the morning of the final session, the room was entirely quiet. He arranged the documents in front of him with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has done this kind of work for a long time. He looked at the defense table. He looked at the prosecution table. He looked at the gallery briefly, and then he looked back at the papers. His expression as he opened the top folder contained something I recognized from 30 years of professional work. It was the expression of a person who has examined a set of numbers with great care and has arrived at a conclusion that is not in dispute. He reached for the gavel. He brought it down once, cleanly, and the sound moved through the courtroom the way important sounds do, not loudly, but with considerable weight, reaching every corner and leaving behind it a silence that felt entirely different from the silence that had come before. The judge spoke for nearly 40 minutes before he arrived at the sentences. He began by describing the case in terms that were both precise and, to anyone sitting in that gallery, deeply familiar. He spoke about the particular nature of trust-based financial fraud, about the specific harm caused not only by the loss of money, but by the deliberate exploitation of relationships that victims had extended in good faith. He spoke about the duration of the scheme, its calculated design, and the degree to which those who had orchestrated it had done so with full awareness of the damage being caused to people who had trusted them. He spoke about what had been done to Gerald. He did not use that name. He referred to him as the original company founder, whose health had been monitored without his knowledge and whose final documented wishes had been deliberately obstructed. But I knew exactly who he was describing, and I believe everyone in that room did. Then he turned to the sentences. Victor was asked to stand. He stood the way he had stood at the end of the arrests, with the particular forward lean of someone whose specific kind of confidence has been so thoroughly removed that the body has not yet found a new way to carry itself. The judge looked at him directly and stated that the court was imposing a term of 12 years in a federal penitentiary with no eligibility for early release during the initial period. 12 years. I watched Victor receive those words and watched them settle somewhere behind his eyes in the place where the arrogance had been, and I felt no particular satisfaction, which surprised me somewhat. What I felt was closer to the sensation of a door closing on something that had been open for too long. Sandra received 8 years. She was crying when the sentence was delivered, the same calibrated crying she had maintained throughout the proceedings. But when the number was spoken aloud, the crying shifted into something different, something less managed and more genuine. And I understood that the distance between performing distress and actually experiencing consequence had finally closed for her entirely. Kyle received 5 years of supervised probation, contingent on the conditions already agreed upon. The judge noted for the record that his cooperation had been material to the outcome, and that his willingness to testify reflected a degree of moral clarity the court was prepared to acknowledge. Kyle sat very still when the sentence was read and did not look at either of his parents. After the session ended and the gallery began to clear, Robert Weston found me in the corridor outside the courtroom. He was carrying a document in a manila envelope and handed it to me without preamble. He said the federal court had issued the formal order that morning, coinciding with the conclusion of the sentencing phase. The mortgage authorization bearing the forged signature had been ruled invalid from its inception. The lien against the property had been permanently removed. There were no remaining encumbrances, no pending claims, and no further proceedings that could affect the title. He said the house on Magnolia Drive was mine, fully and without condition. I stood in the corridor of the federal courthouse and held the document and looked at it for a moment without reading it, because I did not need to read it. I simply needed to hold it. I thanked Weston. He shook my hand and said that Gerald had been a good man who had loved his wife very well. I told him I knew that, and that I was grateful he had helped Gerald find a way to say so clearly. Emily and Michael were waiting near the main entrance. I walked out between them into the spring afternoon, and the light was the particular light of early April in Charlotte, warm without being hot, the kind of light that feels like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something difficult. I stopped on the courthouse steps and reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Gerald's letter was folded exactly where I had placed it the morning I had first read it in Weston's office. I had carried it every day since. I unfolded the last page and read the final paragraph one more time, standing in the April light with my children beside me. And when I finished, I folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back where it belonged. We drove home together. I pulled into the driveway on Magnolia Drive and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The house looked exactly as it always had. The red brick and the white trim, and the front porch with the 2 green wooden chairs Gerald had painted himself the summer before the diagnosis. It looked like 34 years. It looked like the right kind of ordinary. I got out and stood on the front porch. The magnolia tree was in the early stages of its spring bloom. The buds were still tight and pale green at the tips, just beginning to show the white at the edges. That meant the flowers were preparing to open. Gerald had been right about that tree every single spring for 34 years. It was always spectacular. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, looking at the yard and the tree and the quiet street in the April afternoon. Emily came and stood beside me. She asked what I was going to do next. I looked at the magnolia tree. I thought about the house and its rooms, and the particular quality of the light in the kitchen in the mornings, and the way the back porch felt in the evenings, and what it might mean to fill those spaces with something new and genuinely purposeful. I have an idea, I said, and I think Gerald would approve. 6 months after the sentencing, the lower floor of the house on Magnolia Drive was under renovation. The dining room had been reconfigured to accommodate a longer table and additional seating. The room off the entry hall, which Gerald had used as a home office and which had been largely unchanged since his illness, had been emptied and repainted in a pale, warm yellow, with 2 upholstered chairs positioned near the window and a small wooden desk against the far wall. The kitchen had been updated with a second coffee station and a new oven that Emily had helped me select on a Saturday afternoon in February. Both of us standing in an appliance showroom, having a good-natured disagreement about whether it was larger than necessary. Gerald would have said it was exactly the right size. The contractor who oversaw the renovation asked me, near the beginning of the project, what the space was going to be used for. I told him it was going to be a resource center for women who had found themselves in difficult financial and legal circumstances and needed guidance from someone who understood the specifics of their situation from the inside. He had nodded and asked no further questions and done very good work. The Sunday Table Foundation opened in the early part of October. The first person who came was not there for the formal opening event, which was scheduled for the following weekend. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, having driven from Greensboro on her own after finding the organization's information through a referral from a legal aid clinic in Guilford County. She was 67 years old, a retired school teacher named Margaret, and she sat down across from me in the yellow room, put her hands in her lap, and looked at the table between us with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is not yet certain it is safe to set it down. I recognized that expression with complete precision. I had worn it myself in this same house at a different table not quite a year before. She described her situation in careful, abbreviated terms, the way people describe things when they are not yet sure they deserve to be taken seriously. A brother-in-law, a company her late husband had founded, documents she had been asked to sign without adequate time to review, a phone that had gone quiet in the months since the funeral, and a distance in her children's voices that she had been attributing to her own grief. I listened without speaking until she stopped. "I don't know where to start," she said, when the abbreviated version had been told, and the silence had stretched long enough that she felt the need to acknowledge it. I reached across the small table and placed my hand on hers. "I know," I said. "Start by telling me." The formal opening of the Sunday Table Foundation took place the following Sunday morning, the way the organization's name had always suggested it would. 7 women came, ranging in age from 58 to 74, from 4 different counties across the greater Charlotte region. Some had found us through legal referrals. One had read a brief account of the trial in a regional newspaper. 2 had been referred by the same grief counselor, who had been encountering similar stories with troubling frequency and had reached out to us the week before. I had set the table the evening prior. The wedding china was out. The full 12-place setting from the shop in Asheville, arranged carefully on the long new table. Fresh magnolia branches stood in the glass vase on the sideboard. I had ironed the white linen tablecloth, and the room carried the smell of the coffee I had started before anyone arrived. The same dark roast I had been making every morning for 34 years. The 7 women came in and found their seats, and looked at the table and the room and at one another with the careful openness of people who have agreed to be somewhere unfamiliar because they needed to be somewhere and were not yet certain what that somewhere would offer them. I looked at them from my place at the head of the table. I looked at the careful posture, the hands folded in laps, the expressions of women who had spent years being told in one form or another that their understanding of their own circumstances was not to be trusted. I saw the particular learned smallness that settles into the way a person carries herself when she has been minimized and managed and kept at the edges of her own life for long enough that it begins to feel like the natural arrangement of things. Gerald had seen something like that in me once, and then he had looked at me differently, and that different way of being seen had gradually become the way I understood myself. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out the letter. I unfolded it to the last page and found the paragraph I had read, perhaps 100 times since the morning in Weston's office. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the attention of a man who understood precisely what he was writing and why. I read it aloud. "This woman right here," I said, reading Gerald's words slowly and clearly. "Smartest person I have ever known. Do not let anyone tell you different. Patty." I folded the letter and looked up at the 7 women sitting around the table. "He wrote this for me," I said. "But today I am reading it for all of you." The room was quiet for a moment afterward, the particular quiet of something true, being received by people who have not heard enough true things recently. Margaret, the retired schoolteacher from Greensboro, set her coffee cup down and straightened slightly in her chair, one by one, around that table. The others did the same. "They were wrong," I said, "when they thought we were the weakest ones in the room." There is a particular quality to an evening in a house that has become genuinely quiet. Not the quiet of waiting, which is always underlaid with tension, the low, persistent sense of something unresolved. Not the quiet of absence, which carries its own specific weight, familiar to anyone who has moved through the early months after a significant loss. This is the quiet of a house simply resting at the end of an ordinary day, occupied by one person who has nothing pressing remaining, and no particular urgency about the hours ahead. I made coffee at 7:30 in the evening. 2 cups, the way I always do. I set them both on the counter and looked at them the way I have been looking at them every morning since April of the year Gerald died. And I thought about why I continue to do it. Not as an act of grief, which is what it might have appeared to be in the beginning. Something else now. Something closer to an acknowledgement that a person does not stop being present in your life simply because they are no longer physically in the room. I sat down at the kitchen table with one of the cups and a few sheets of plain white paper and a pen, and I wrote Gerald a letter. I do this from time to time now, not on any schedule, but when something has happened that I want to tell him about, or when I have been thinking through something and find that the thinking becomes clearer when I write it, as though explaining it to someone specific. He was always the person I explained things to. 34 years of talking through the day before sleep, in the dark, with the window open in summer and the extra blanket pulled up in winter. It turns out that the habit of telling him things did not end with him. I wrote about the foundation. I described Margaret sitting in the yellow room on that first Tuesday, and the way she had held her hands carefully in her lap. And I told him about the 7 women at the table last Sunday, and what it had felt like to watch them straighten in their chairs one after another when I read his words aloud. I told him I had read his letter to people who needed to hear it. I told him I hoped he did not mind. I wrote that I thought he would have liked Margaret. She has a direct, practical intelligence that she spent years disguising as compliance, and she is now, several months into the process of reclaiming herself, learning to stop doing that. I told him that watching a person remember who they actually are is not unlike watching the magnolia tree in the spring, which he already knew, since he had been pointing it out to me every year for 3 decades. Then I put the pen down and looked out the kitchen window at the tree itself, which was in the full middle of its bloom, the flowers open and white against the late afternoon light, and I talked to him instead of writing, the way I sometimes do when writing feels insufficient for what I am trying to say. I told him I understood now why he had left that card in the drawer with his watch. I told him I understood the particular kind of protection it represented, the kind that trusts the other person to know what to do with what they have been given, rather than trying to manage the outcome from a distance. I told him it was the most Gerald thing he had ever done, which is saying a great deal, given the considerable competition. There are things I know now that I did not know when this year began, and I want to say them plainly. I know that grief, when it is used against you, reveals something useful. They calculated that my sorrow would make me easy to manage, that a woman who had set aside her career to care for her husband would be softened by loss into someone who needed to be led. They did not understand that the same grief sharpened something that had nothing to do with weakness. They did not understand that sometimes we see most clearly in the darkest moments, when everything unnecessary falls away and nothing remains but what we actually know. I know that the way others see you is not the same as what you are. They saw a 61-year-old retired widow who had stepped away from her profession to tend to a sick husband. They decided on that basis that I had become someone without resources. They did not see 30 years of precisely the expertise required to dismantle what they had built. The mistake was entirely theirs, but I understand now how easy it is to forget what you know when the people around you have spent long enough reminding you of what you have given up. And I know that family is not a word that explains itself. Blood does not purchase loyalty. Loyalty is built by how you treat people when no one is watching, when the choice is inconvenient, when showing up costs you something real. Gerald built it that way with me for 34 years. Margaret is beginning to understand what it looks like when it is constructed that way. The 7 women at that table on Sunday were learning to tell the difference between what was being done to them and what they actually deserved. I finished the letter and folded it carefully along even creases. I set it on the kitchen table beside the second coffee cup, the one I had made for Gerald and would not drink. I looked out the window at the magnolia tree in the late afternoon light, the flowers open and unhurried, exactly as he had always said they would be every single spring. I took the remaining coffee cup with me when I stepped back outside. The air on the back porch was the particular mild of late spring that only holds for a few weeks before the Charlotte summer arrives and makes its intentions known. The magnolia tree stood in the yard exactly where Gerald had planted it 31 years ago, its flowers open and unhurried in the evening light, exactly as he had always said they would be every single spring without fail. I stood at the railing for a while and looked at it. And then I want to speak to you directly, the way I would speak to a friend sitting across a kitchen table at the end of a very long day. What happened to me was not extraordinary, Calk. I know it might look that way from the outside, with the federal agents and the 200 pages of evidence and the wedding china and everything that followed. But the shape of it, the underlying pattern, is one I have now encountered again and again in the yellow room down the hall. A woman who gave significant portions of herself to the people she loved. A woman who stepped away from her career when her family needed her. A woman who found herself alone afterward in a house that had been reorganized entirely around someone else's presence, trying to remember who she was before that question had become almost too uncomfortable to ask. If any part of that description found something inside you, I am very glad you stayed to the end of this story. I want to say something about those years of showing up, the difficult mornings and the harder evenings, learning everyone else's needs and schedules and fears before you allowed yourself to think about your own. Those years were not wasted. And they were not weakness. They did not diminish you, regardless of what the people around you may have suggested or implied. Every skill you built in that time, every piece of yourself you invested in the people you loved, is still in you. It does not leave simply because the circumstances changed. What they took from you was always temporary. What you kept was always permanent. I want to say something about being underestimated. They saw a 61-year-old retired widow who had set aside her career to tend to a sick husband. They decided, on that basis alone, that I had become someone without resources, someone whose future was theirs to manage. They did not see 30 years of precisely the expertise required to dismantle exactly what they had built. The mistake was entirely theirs, but I understand now, more clearly than I ever did before, how easy it is to forget what you know when the people closest to you have spent long enough reminding you only of what you have given up. I want to say something about the doubting, that particular kind that arrives slowly, carefully, through people you trust, asking you to question your own memory and your own judgment. Your doubts were not evidence of their accuracy. They were evidence that the tactic was working. The moment you recognize that difference is the moment the tactic stops working entirely. And I want to say something about family. Blood does not purchase loyalty. Loyalty is built by how you treat people when no one is watching, when the choice is inconvenient, when showing up costs you something real. Gerald built it that way with me for 34 years. The women who come through the door of this house on Sunday mornings are learning, slowly and with real courage, what that kind of care actually looks and feels like when it is genuine. Gerald used to say that God places certain seasons of loss in our lives, not to diminish us, but because he already knows what we are capable of carrying, before we know it ourselves. I did not feel capable the morning I stood at that kitchen counter, looking at 2 cups of coffee and only needing one of them. But God does not ask us to feel strong before we begin. He asks only that we take the next step. And I believe, with everything I have learned this year, that God was already standing at the far end of that step, waiting to show me what I had been holding inside me all along. If this story found you today, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Leave me a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what part of this journey reached you most. Share it with the woman in your life who needs to be reminded that the years she has lived are not a burden. They are a foundation that no one can take from her. And if you would like to stay for more stories told this way, I will be right here. I went back inside. I set the coffee cup in the sink and stood at the entrance to the dining room for a long moment, looking at the table. The wedding china was stacked carefully on the sideboard, waiting to be used again on Sunday. I walked to it and placed my hand on the top plate, on the blue-painted flowers that had traveled from a little shop in Asheville to this house, to the worst evening of that long year, and all the way back to this room, still whole and entirely intact. I looked at Gerald's chair at the head of the table. It was empty the way it had been empty since April. But this evening, I was not looking at what was missing. I was looking at everything that had stayed. The house, the tree outside the window, the 7 women who had straightened in their chairs at this table last Sunday, one by one, quietly and without being asked. The letter folded on the kitchen table, all of it left deliberately and with great care by a man who had trusted without reservation that his wife would know exactly what to do with what she had been given. I turned off the kitchen light. I stepped back out onto the porch. The Charlotte sky in late April was clear and very dark, beyond the glow of the nearby streetlights, and the stars were visible in a way they rarely are this close to a city. The kind of clear night that makes you understand why people throughout all of history have looked upward and felt both small and precisely located at the same time. I stood for a moment with my hands on the railing and looked at the magnolia tree and the sky above it. Then I smiled, not at anything in particular, simply because it was a good evening and the tree was beautiful, and I was standing in my own house at the end of a year that had taken a great deal from me and returned considerably more. I went inside and closed the door gently behind me